What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over dropping our weapons. So in the previous episode what we did was we were allowing the character to go up to weapons and only hold, say, a max of 2. So I have one weapon currently and I can hold, let's say, this assault rifle. I picked it up and I can swap between them. Now if I want, I can swap out this blaster for the submachine gun. And now I have these two weapons. So we have a weapon swapping system that works here, but we were never actually detaching the weapon and putting it back into the world and allowing us to pick it up again later. It was literally you swapped with them and the weapon essentially disappeared. So now what we're going to do is leave these weapons in the world so we can swap them again, just like this. And that way we can drop them on the ground and other players, enemies, whatever, can pick them up and use them in the future. Or we can pick them up if we have to swap in the future. So that's what we're going to be covering today because we didn't cover that. There will be at least one other part on this because we will need to be able to have this have physics so we can, say, fall to the ground and actually move accordingly as it should. Right now they just float. They probably shouldn't do that. And there's actually a relatively simple way in Unreal to get that to work, but it deserves an episode of its own because we can use that system for all objects that are in the air like that we want to have some physics on them. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. I believe we're on episode 34 of the first-person shooter tutorial series. If you'd like to get caught up, I'll leave this link right here in the top right corner. It's a playlist to every other first-person shooter episode. It's retroactive and current, so you can check out all the ones in the past, but you can also check out the ones that are going to be added after this episode. So whenever you're watching this, you'll see all the latest episodes for the first-person shooter series. I'll also link this episode right here, which is the previous episode. That's the one where we went over the maximum amount of weapons we could hold and equipping those two weapons in our inventory, or however many weapons in the inventory. That will definitely be used in today's episode, so if you haven't watched that, I'd recommend it. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. So let's go to our code, and we're going to look at our FPS tutorial character and our base weapon today. So let's start off by going to our base weapon because there's one quick thing we have to add here. So in our base weapon, I'm going to add this drop weapon BP function. What this is this is going to do all the blueprint logic that we need our weapon to do when we drop it. Just like with the interact stuff that we had, sometimes we have things in blueprint that we want to do at the same time. As well as the code. Like, for example, if we have a component that we put on a blueprint and we didn't spawn it from the code class, then we may want to access the blueprint to be able to modify those things. Alternatively, you can spawn the component in the code class and then just access it from there. So it's up to you how you want to do it. But to not complicate things, I'm leaving everything where it is, not moving it around. But I'm adding a new function that can be used to do things like re-enable pickup colliders once a weapon has been dropped. In the future, doing things like remove attachments, like in Apex Legends. If you have attachments on your weapon and you drop your weapon, it's no longer equipped. The attachments also come off of it so they can be looted. And then it's etc. Just, anything else that you can think of. So make sure you make it a blueprint implementable event if you go this route, because we want to make sure that we can call this function from wherever we want in the code. However, it needs to be an event that we can fill out in the blueprint. Alright. So let's go to our FPS tutorial character.cpp now. I don't think we have any changes in the .h, so we might as well just go straight to the CPP. And we're going to need to do really two main things. So the first thing is, let's scroll all the way down until we get to our interact logic. Alright. And we're also going to need to edit our drop weapon function, which we set up in the previous episode, but we never finished. So let's look at interact for a second. Now interact is going to look mostly the same with one minor change, And this is this ownership logic that we have here. When we were calling interact BP, we were setting the owner of a weapon to be, whatever, to be the character that interacted with it, essentially. But it could be all sorts of stuff if you wanted to. What we need to do, though, is make sure that if no one owns this weapon, then, it can be picked up, it can be equipped again, and if we drop it, there is no longer an owner on that weapon. This will also allow us to know when we can interact with the pickup collider, or in the future, if we do raycasts to pick up weapons. So say I have to look at the weapon with my reticle to be able to acquire it, then this would be the same thing. We want to make sure that we're keeping track of if this weapon is owned by a player or a character or an enemy or whatever. So it seems like a small detail. Toward the end of this episode, you'll really see why it's important. But in our interact function, and specifically in the else statement here. So if we take a step back, what we're doing in this interact function is we're seeing if we have any actor to interact with. This is set in the blueprints when we collide with one of the pickup colliders. So what that means is essentially when I enter this field of which I can pick up the assault rifle. I don't have to be looking at it in this case. We just have a bounding box around this object. If I'm close enough to it, I can pick it up. Okay? When you see that press E to equip, that is essentially that's saying, okay, we are overlapping with this. We have an interact actor. So if there is an interact actor, then we see if it's a weapon. We don't have any other types of items to interact with at the moment, but this will be useful in the future. But if it is a weapon, then what we're going to do is go into this logic here, where we check and see if the number of weapons the character has is already greater than or equal to the maximum, meaning they already have as many weapons as they can hold. So at this rate, we want to replace a weapon as opposed to just add it to our inventory. All right. So in the else of this, meaning that we don't have the maximum number of weapons. In this case, I can hold 2 weapons. When I start the game, I only have 1 weapon. So if I pick up a weapon right off the bat, it goes into this logic, which gives me my second weapon. In this set of logic, we need to set the owner. So interact weapon is my casted weapon off of the interact actor. Okay? And that is what we end up adding to our weapons array and keeping track of in the future. That way we know how to pull this weapon back out and how much ammo it has and all those details about it. What we have to also add here is we have to set the owner of interact weapon, and we have to set the owner to this. Like you would do in Blueprint, how you would put self or get a reference to self to reference the class that you're in. This in C++ does the same thing. So we're saying interact weapon set owner this. So we're setting it to this FPS tutorial character. And as the comment says, we're setting the owner of this weapon to be the character that picked it up. Okay? Now, with that, keep that in mind because we need to do that in swap weapon with another as well. Okay? So this is just if we're picking it up. This is if we're swapping weapons with another. Let's go to swap weapon with another. What we're doing here is we're calling drop weapon because we're dropping the weapon we have at that current spot, and then we're adding this new weapon. We'll get to this in a moment. Let's look at drop weapon, but just keep in mind what we did here and why we did it, okay? And now, say we go into drop weapon. Before, here's what we were doing. We were saying we don't have access to this weapon any longer, and we were removing it from our array. Well, that's good. However, it's not quite enough because we want to be able to spawn it back in the world, we want to reset the owner, and we want to do any blueprint-related logic such as enabling or disabling pickup colliders to determine if other players or other characters can pick them up in the world. So first things first, we need to remove it from the player and the character. It needs to be brought back into the world, not attached to any of the sockets, not attached to the character. The easiest way to do it is this right here. At least it's the easiest in my opinion. There are several ways to do this, and they can have different results, so you may need to go a more specific route in the future. So what we're doing here is I have my weapons array, and I'm accessing the index to drop. This is something we set up in the previous episode. But essentially we're accessing the correct weapon at the index that we know we're going to be dropping. So this is the weapon we're dropping. we're going to be removing it from the array. We need to first detach it from the character that's holding it. So I just call it detach from actor. And you need to pass it in this F detachment transform rules, which I know seems a little bit weird. But this is basically a static function call, meaning I'm passing in this as my parameter. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying, these are the parameters for detach from actor. You need to pass in this structure, this F detachment transform rules. And you have different methods in here, like location, rotation, scale, or keep world, keep relative. I'm fine with keeping everything the same as it is as it was in the world and as it is when attached to the character. So I'm just going to keep world transform. So after I keep the world transform, I detach it. It's exactly where it was when being held by the player, but now it's in the world, as opposed to being attached to any of the sockets on the character. So it's basically going to stay in the exact pose that it was at. And this is true because when you play the game, say I go to reload my weapon, and right now I don't have anything against swapping and reloading at the same time. So you can see that the gun was pointed up in the air because it was currently reloading, and I detached. So it stopped everything it was doing, and now it's in that animation. When we get into simulating physics, it won't matter anyway, but just to kind of show you what's going on there with the whole keep detachment rules and all that. Okay. And once you do this, now we're going to reset the owner. Just like we set the owner above in the interact, we're going to reset the owner because we don't want to have anyone owning it at this point. We've dropped the weapon, so we're done with it. So I just grab the weapon, call set owner, and I pass in null pointer, which is basically, as it sounds, an empty or invalid pointer. And basically we're saying we don't want an owner at all. We're assigning no one to be the owner. Then that drop weapon BP event that we created in the base weapon in here, I'm calling it here as well. So after we reset the owner and detach it, there may be other things I want to do in here. We'll get into that once we're in the engine, but I'm just calling it here just so you can see it. And then I still do the two things we did before, which is essentially taking away the ability to use this weapon for the character that had it, and then removing it from the array so they can't even swap to it or anything like that. Okay. Lastly, we have, if we go back into swap weapon with another, because remember, we called swap weapon with another, it calls drop weapon, which is how we got here. Now let's look at it. Let's go through the rest of this function now to finish off our code. So in swap weapon with another, we drop our weapon, we add this new weapon to our array that I've called _new weapon, and say, yeah, we've obtained it. The player can swap to it. We need to now set this owner of this weapon, so the owner of this new weapon, to be this. Again, just like we did before, that's setting it to this character here. This is because this weapon has been added to their array of weapons, meaning they own the weapon. So we need to set the owner. And now the ownership is always going to be correct. You can see this when you're playing. If you actually click on your character. So if we click on our weapons array, open it up and check it out here, we have our array here, and it updates as it should. As you can see, the weapons that get replaced do genuinely get replaced, but you can see that these weapons they should be, logically, children of the character. The character is the owner of them. They're the ones holding them in their array. Two players cannot hold the same weapon at the same time, unless you have some sort of like a double player weapon, two players required to use this weapon or something. But for, any standard weapons like your guns, they're going to be a single player that is holding them. And so we want to make sure those owners are correct, because we're going to use that to keep track of some things in the blueprint, and we're going to get into that here in a second. But once you have that done with the code, everything else you have is fine and you can leave it alone. So let's go into Unreal and let's take a look at two things. The first thing we are going to need is our base weapon BP. And the second thing we'll need is actually our character class, our base character BP. So let's start with base character BP and let's go through our logic a little bit here. So there's a few changes we're going to need to make. The first thing and the major thing is that we have this interact BP that I was using before, and I actually don't need it anymore. Believe it or not. The reason we had this is because we wanted to do logic on the pickup collider. But the problem with doing this interact BP here is that if we are calling it toward the end here after we've swapped our weapons and all, and we set our owner, the owner is going to be incorrect depending on what we do. Because if we swap our weapon, the weapon index that we passed in is never going to be valid, or at least it's never going to be the same weapon that we started with. We're swapping it with another, so we're interacting with the wrong weapon. It didn't matter last episode, but now that we need to be able to pick up these items again in the future, or have other players be able to pick up these weapons, we need to make sure this is completely accurate. So, with that in mind, I don't need to set the owner in here anymore. But then when you look at it, I don't need to actually reset the pickup collider in here anymore either, because we can do that in another spot. So if I get rid of this, then all I have is this cast, and I don't need that anymore. So you can keep the interact BP in here, because we will definitely be able to use it in the future for some good stuff. But actually, because of this episode, we don't need to fill it out anymore. So I disconnected it previously, but now you can see I've removed everything, and it will still work fine. Remember I said we could actually move where we're ignoring the pickup colliders? Well, we can and we should, because if we don't ignore it here, what's going to happen is we're going to be able to pick up a weapon, pick up another weapon, and then when we swap weapons, our pickup collider would be re-enabled because of our logic. Our ownership would be a little bit off, and our interaction would be a little bit delayed. So we would be able to essentially equip our weapon that's already in our inventory, and we don't want to do that. So instead, let's do it the correct way, and let's reset our interact actor when we're either out of the bounds of a pickup collider, or we need to be able to reset it when we're dropping it and picking it up, because we don't want to be able to interact with the same actor that we've already equipped and brought into our inventory. Something we actually never set up before. So first things first, when we switch weapons, we want to make sure that we are ignoring pickup colliders flat out, okay? Because this event switch weapon is getting called on both cases. Whether we're picking it up and adding it to our inventory, or we're swapping it out with another gun we have, we do want to ignore the collider on that, because at this point it belongs to the player that has it in their inventory. Okay, so instead of trying to do it when we're interacting with it and all this weird behavior, all we really need to do is in switch weapon, we have this change crosshairs call at the end. If you just go right after that, I'm actually casting to my base weapon BP because I need to grab the pickup collider on it, specifically this rectangle here. It dictates where we can interact with this, and the code class doesn't have that currently. So I'm grabbing I have weapon index that I'm using when attaching these weapons to the correct socket so that they look good in the game. I drag off that array and I cast it to a base weapon BP, which will or at least should succeed, because this weapons array is a base weapon type. So it should succeed this cast, and then I can drag off, get the pickup collider right here. And then I can drag off this and set collision response channels to all channels. And I'm going to ignore it. Basically, I'm disabling the pickup collider for the weapon when we switch weapons. Not only does that make our system a little bit more convenient and less confusing, but it eliminates any issues with being able to see the equip text when we shouldn't, and being able to equip our weapon that we already have in our inventory. Both of those are bad and not good, so it's better to have them solved. Now, the other thing that we need to make sure we do is we need to be careful with our interact actor. We actually weren't resetting it everywhere we had to, so you have to be careful. But in our event display equip message, this is when we've overlapped with the bounding box, the pickup collider, so the character is overlapped with the weapon. And we bring up this little message to say, you know, press E to equip this type of weapon. We were casting to the weapon type and setting our interact actor. Well, that was good. Okay, that was right. But let's look at our character. And let's look at interact actor. I don't know exactly where it's at, but here we go. Interact actor. So before, we would say hover over this Kingslayer, we would stop overlapping with the assault rifle, and then the text would go away, but the interact actor on the right here would actually still have the assault rifle because we weren't resetting it everywhere we need to. That's also insanely important that we do this correctly. Otherwise, you could actually equip it. You could walk into it, walk away from it, and equip the weapon from all the way over there because it was still set as your interaction actor. All right, so we have to make sure we're resetting that properly. So if you go into your base weapon BP, let's take a look at this for a second. So we scroll up. I'm scrolling up to these functions here where we have on-component begin overlap and on-component end overlap with the pickup collider. This is what I was just telling you about. This is where we set the interact actor. When we end overlap, we were casting the FPS tutorial character to make sure it was the FPS tutorial character that was ending overlap with the pickup collider. And then we were saying hide equip message, but we never did this before. Well, we absolutely have to do this. That way we reset the interact actor. It's only valid when we're currently overlapping with this object. So the way we do this is we literally set interact actor, and you can leave it blank, just like this. You can see I've plugged nothing into it. So it's going to set it to a null value. It's basically like we're doing this. All right, we're essentially passing a null to it, meaning reset it. Now, doing that will allow this to always be valid because we want this to, you know, not be set when we end overlap with it. Well, if we disable the pickup collider, this is also going to say, oh, we're ending overlap with it, and thus it will set the interact actor to be null. So the next thing we have to do is make sure that we can re-enable the pickup collider when we drop the weapon, okay? Because let's do it like this. All right. So with what we have in place now, we can go up to a weapon, equip it. Go up to another weapon, and drop it. Perfect. So we have that working perfectly. But now let's say we walk into here. All right. Well, I can't equip it again. What's wrong with it? Well, we need to re-enable the collider. Just because it's dropped doesn't mean that all is good, okay? We still need to re-enable the collider. Just because we don't have the text coming up anymore because we dropped it, even though that's fixed, we never actually took into account what we'd have to do to pick it back up. So once we drop the weapon, we have this drop weapon BP, remember, that we were calling once it's actually detached and we reset the owner. Once we drop it, we need to go into our base weapon BP where we made this, grab our custom event, drop weapon BP, and fill out the logic for it. Since we're in the weapon, we have the pickup collider, so we just literally get the pickup collider, type set collision response to all channels, and we want it to be overlap now, not ignore. Because overlap is how we do our checks to see if the character is overlapping with it right here. On component begin overlap, on component end overlap. So if it's ignoring it, it won't hit any of these checks, and thus it won't display the messages or set the interaction actor. And there you go. So now with this in place, we will be able to walk over to our weapon, equip it, the text goes away. Okay, there's no weapon left behind. Perfect. Now let's say I walk up to this weapon, equip it, I drop a weapon in its place, and then the next time I go over it, I press E to equip the Kingslayer. I have two of the same gun right now, okay? And let's pick this one. There we go. Perfect. So now I can go and I can pick up these weapons as I please and drop them back into the world, literally swapping them out. One thing you will notice is that these weapons are still actually like moving up and down. That's because they're still technically attached to the socket that is moving up and down. So they still have a little bit of like breathing that they do. This will get fixed when we go over all the physics episodes and allowing them to drop and fall on their own. So it's not a big deal for now, but just so you know, if you see that, that is normal. And anyway, guys, that's pretty much it. This will allow you to drop your weapons back into the world, swap them out so you can have a maximum number of weapons, and allow other players in the future, or again, enemies, if you have enemies that can pick up, say, your weapons or, you know, player weapons, and they can pick them up and they can use them against you. So these basically allow them to be objects in the scene, in the world that exists, and regardless if you've equipped them or not, we track who it belongs to and where it's at. That way we know exactly what to do with it when someone else needs it or someone else walks by it. Can they equip it? Now they can. But anyway, guys, that is all I got. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. There's more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys so much for the love. I am really, really so grateful. I really appreciate it. And I am so glad I can continue to share these episodes with you week after week. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. It's completely free. I'll be happy to get you set up and help you with anything that you need. But otherwise, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.